Hi, and welcome to Lee on the Lectionary, and this week we're looking at the readings for the week known as Proper 20, and those readings are Jonah chapter 3 verse 10 to chapter 4 verse 11, Philippians chapter 1 verse 21 to verse 30, and Matthew 20 verses 1 to 16. This week we are confronted in the readings with two reactions to the laboriously awaited kingdom of our gracious God. The Gospel reading and the Old Testament reading both illustrate the sin of envy. Jonah is none too pleased with the repentance of the Gentiles in Nineveh. In response to his preaching, they turned from their evil ways. We wish that those rampaging around in that area would go and do likewise. In response, God turned away from the calamity of judgment with which he had threatened them. There is no need to posit a contradiction between Jonah chapter 3 verse 10 and the doctrine of God's unchangeableness. It seems to me anyway. He only changed his mind in the sense that the original threat of destruction had within it the inherent offer of an alternative future if only the Ninevites heeded the warning that God sent via his prophet. Why else would he go to such trouble to send a messenger in the first place? Numbers 23 verse 19 is not a lie. God is compassionate and gracious. Jonah, however, is not. He envies the care that God has for his enemies, that he feels about the Assyrian capital as we may feel about the most brutal regimes in our world. His first thought was not forgiveness, but vengeance. God should repay them for what they have done and were threatening to do to the good guys, and not pardon them, not let them off. It all seemed wrong to the ancient prophet. And it is just as incomprehensible to most people today. But we don't usually run off to Tarshish to escape the call of the loving God, as Jonah did. We have other ways of avoiding it. Jonah's anger with God's slowness to anger was unwarranted. He should, like God, have been deeply concerned for the city of 120,000 souls who persistently failed to discern right from wrong and not only rejected God's plan for human flourishing, but actively opposed it. Instead, his dominant emotion was anger, despite being forcibly reminded of his own frailty and need for salvation. They didn't deserve grace, but they got it. Jonah feels hard done by. The parable of the labourers in the vineyard hits a similar raw nerve. Several groups of workers agree a fair wage and get down to business. They wouldn't have complained at all, except the master of the vineyard decided to reward the latecomers with exactly the same pay as those who had toiled all day in the scorching heat. The landowner rejects the petition of their union. They agreed on wages and he'd stuck to their bargain. But they were envious because he was generous. They didn't like grace being given to those they considered undeserving. But just as in the story of Jonah, God gets to decide what to do with the things he has made and owns. In Nineveh, the people and the animals. In the vineyard, his money. In Philippians chapter 1, the Apostle Paul is also wrestling with the themes of fruitful labour and his reward. He longs to be with Christ, for that is far better. But for the sake of these Gentiles, he is content to delay that glorious moment, and even actually to lose his salvation for others, if you read places like Romans chapter 9 verse 3, despite what it might mean for him. How different to the attitude of Jonah. What a contrast to the labourers in Jesus' parable. The Philippians are urged to imitate Paul by living a life that is worthy of the gospel, of a compassionate and gracious God, unintimidated by the opposition, unfazed by the suffering they may have to endure. Let us strive side by side for the same goal and the same prize.